Can you tell me a little bit about your background in relation to complexity theory, where you worked and kind of what you've done?
Yeah, I think it's quite useful to say that, like a lot of people who went into social sciences in the 60s, I actually came from somewhere else. Yeah, in the sense that my secondary education was in sciences. I have A levels in physics, chemistry, biology, and maths. Right, and I went to medical school. Decided I would make a terrible clinician, but, and this is not irrelevant, I liked physiology. I was very good at physiology, okay, which is systems based. So in my head were various things which were to do, which gave me a kind of framing. Yeah. And I also, rather unusually, did an undergraduate degree in what was called sociology, and in my day, social administration, but it had a hell of a lot of statistics in it. Yeah. So I did a lot of statistics, and I did as much statistics as I could because I had A-level physics and maths and could get 100% in stats exams, right? Yeah. So I was always somebody who did a lot of quantitative work as a sociologist. And I did a lot of investigations about causality. I did a big study of housing and health in the 1980s, and was at that point reading a very, very good book on the survey method by, Catherine Marsh, right? Who reminded me about realism, about realism, right? And that was useful because in order to understand the relationships between housing and health, you have to think in realist terms and think in terms of complex causation. And a very simple example is, bizarrely, we discovered that, surprise, surprise, the better the housing, the better the health, except for old people. And it was, of course, as always on a survey, you ask the interviewers what's going on, and the interviewers tell you. They said a lot of these old people are living in sheltered accommodation, which is always very, very good. But how do you get into sheltered accommodation? You're ill to start with. So the causality had turned around, if you see what I mean. It's a classic interaction effect, actually, and I've used that in an encyclopedia entry. So when I encountered complexity, which was by reading what is called the big popular science book that a lot of people read, it just rang so many bells with me. Okay, it rang bells with me about complex causation, about ways in which we could think about these things. And then I did a lot more reading and wrote a preliminary book. I wish I had read Paul Cilliers' book, which was published simultaneously with mine, and he was nice enough to say he wished he'd read mine, because that took me back to the philosophical origins. And it's interesting, Paul, of course, was originally an electrical engineer, right? So it's interesting that he was a person who had come to it by thinking about the technical side of it, but turned to the philosophical traditions. And I realized then, and read a lot more, picked up that there was indeed, going back to the middle 19th century in the response to Darwin, the philosophical response. So that's how I got into it. There were odd little things that really worked. I had done what was called S-level chemistry, which had a lot of physical chemistry in it. So I could kind of pick up where Prigogine was coming from, right? And I had enough maths at one point, although I doubt if I could do this now, to work through Nicholas's lovely little book for master students on the maths of, on as a guide to, I had enough maths to get through that. Yeah. So I could kind of see what was going on. And I've often said that it was my bizarre and very varied education that enabled me to get get a hold of it.
And you wrote Complexity in the Social Sciences in the 1990s, didn't you?
That's right.
Which was a really important book. And you were at the University of Durham.
Yeah, well, I mean, basically, I'd come back to Durham after I had, my first job was at Durham. And then I went off to work as a research director on a community development program, went to work in Northern Ireland, which was a very interesting experience, primarily because I'm half Northern Irish Catholic. And then I came back to Durham, and I've stayed there ever since. And part of it was, I should say, I've always been a teacher. And I've been a teacher of research methods. And I was very much involved in setting up the Masters in Social Research program. I was actually on the ESRC Research Training Board when they introduced the idea that people should have a master's degree in social research methods, so that they were generically trained and could work across the full range. And actually, this was while I was thinking about writing about complexity, and the two things just were like that. They fitted together so well. Yeah.
Brilliant. And I'm wondering if you could explain what complex realism is. That seems an important idea.
Yeah, I mean, that actually is a term that was coined by Reid and Harvey, David L. Harvey, an economist and a sociologist. And it was Jill Callaghan, who I've worked with and with whom I jointly wrote the State of the Art book, and we're talking about writing a second edition of that, who was one of my PhD students at the time. And I was talking to her, and she found that article, right? And I knew about Baskerian realism quite well, but it just connected the two things. Reid and Harvey, and I think that is an extremely important and constructive article. Yeah, they said, look, we've got a scientific ontology, which is complexity, and a philosophical ontology, which is realism. And the two things work together. And they work together because one of the things that realism did, and Andrew Sayre, who wrote a very intelligible and useful book on realism for research methods, really, was kind of surprised that this was the big thing. But it was the way that realism allowed you to think about complex causality, right? And realism gets you past the stupid and absurd divide between the quantitative and the qualitative in science, yeah? Because it recognizes that data is not lying around to be found, yeah? But neither is it just imaginary. It's made, but it's made out of something, yeah? And that I think was such a neat connection with complexity as it's understood in the sciences, yeah? Yeah. And of course, I read Prigogine and Stenger's book, which really does meld philosophy and science very well together. And it's interesting that Stenger's has picked up and run with Whitehead. She's written a lot about Whitehead. I've read her book on Whitehead, which I think it shows that these ideas were around at the beginning of the 20th century as well.
Yeah, no, definitely. So in terms of your own contribution, what would you see if you had to kind of summarize your contribution to the field?
Well, I think it's interesting because I'm somebody who always thought that the primary job of being a university teacher was to teach. Right? Okay. Although I have done a lot of research, yeah. And my partner and I, we're a similar age. We both remember when it was the job of the professor to profess their discipline and teach the first year students. So I've always been somebody who's very, very committed to the pedagogical role. Yeah. And I think the book I wrote was written as a pedagogical book, if you see what I mean, right? It was intended to say to people, look, let's think about this and use it as a basis for thinking certainly about our research programs. And I'll emphasize that my own research has always been to go back to that term social administration and social policy. My master's degree is in social policy and planning from the MSc that applied, yeah? So it's been these two things. It's been trying to think about a pedagogy, yeah? And Jill and I were very much, that was why we wrote the State of the Art book, yeah? That it's a pedagogical book. And I've never written a textbook which, well, I did write a book on social exclusion, which is a kind of textbook, which bizarrely is the book that's made me the most money of anything I've ever written, writing about poverty. But the books I've written, which have had a big complexity favor, I wrote a book on interpreting quantitative data and a book on applying social science. And they're really designed to be read particularly by third-year undergraduates and master's students, yeah? So it's trying to think that what I've done as much as anything is make it a kind of pedagogical thing. Yeah? And I think a lot of people have picked it up in that way, but also the applied side. And then, of course, although I've known Ray Poston for a long time, he's an old mate in some ways, and his book, A Measure for Measures, which is a very important realist book in quantitative social science. When Ray Poston and Nick Tilley got into evaluation in such a big way, and I read their book on realistic evaluation, it again gelled very much. So I've got, in more recent years, a lot into evaluation as part of the applied program. Yeah.
But it's the kind of focus on evaluating complex situations.
Exactly. And recognizing something. We have a research methods cafe in Durham. And I just offered a talk where I said, complex evaluations of complex interventions.
Yeah.
Because the evaluation itself, something Ray Parsons very strong on, is itself a complex system.
Yeah. No. So it feels like complexity thinking has underpinned your work from the beginning, hasn't it?
Well, yeah. As soon as I, God Almighty, I'm terrible with names. I'm trying to remember the guy's name. It's a science journalist. It was really good. As soon as I picked that off a shelf in a Newcastle bookshop and read it, I thought lots of lights went off. Yeah.
Was that Waldrop's book?
That's right. It's Waldrop. Yeah.
No.
And it's just so clear. It's just I have read New Scientist since I was 16, right? So I kind of had a lot of the chaos ideas and stuff like that. Yeah. I always used to say it was my Friday tea time treat. Scientist.
No.
Still is, actually.
Yeah. No, me too. I've been reading New Scientist all my life as well, so I know what you mean.
Yeah.
No, well, that's yes. For me, that kind of relationship between bringing in the qualitative and the quantitative.
Yeah.
Thinking about impact and evaluation, but complex realism is something I really associate with you as having kind of drawn that out in a very helpful.
Yeah, I always say, and I have to say this, it's not my idea, it's David L. Harvey's, and he did it very, very well, but I kind of picked up and ran with it. Yeah. And then maybe something else like that, I kind of pick up and run with things. That I also encountered qualitative comparative analysis, Charles Reagan's approach, QCA, which I encountered when I was writing the book Interpreting Quantitative Data, because I was reading quite a lot about computer-based, what I think qualitative, so they say analysis, but it's really interpretation mostly. Yeah. But I came across QCA and I thought, oh, yeah, that works, right? Because of course, what you have in terms of a truth table of configurations is complex and multiple causations. Yeah. So I picked up on that and became very interested in case-based methods. And Brian Castellani's been nice enough to say that I was the one who coined the idea that cases are complex.
Yeah. No, brilliant. So thinking about the future, I feel that the applied work carries on in complexity, but some of the deeper thinking, the more philosophical and scientific underpinnings of complexity perhaps aren't being, I wouldn't know who to point to quite so easily to say these people are really thinking deeply about these ideas. And I wondered what you thought. What do you think's needed into the future to develop the field of complexity?
I think, well, first of all, I think that the distinction between, look, Ray has a nice line on this. He says, if you look at universities, they sometimes look like a marketplace, right? Yeah, because they're obsessed with getting grants to address real problems. And I agree with them. Both of us agree that this is a good thing. Yeah, it's a good thing in some ways. That the distinction between applied and non-applied work is broken down in lots of ways. And one group that I'm very interested in, because I've been working with them on CCAN, the Centre for Evaluating Complexity Across the Nexus, is the technical professionals in the UK civil service, right? The social researchers, the operational researchers, the statisticians, and even the economists, right? Okay, because they're applied economists, that these are people who have. One of the things we forget is that there's an enormous number of people who are educated in the social sciences now, just as there are in the sciences. Yeah. And one interesting thing that I noticed in my own university, one of our most popular degrees is what's called natural sciences, which is the combined honours degree in science. And these combined degrees were originally general degrees to get cricketers to come to Durham University, right? But now they have to have 3 years at A-level to get into them. Okay. And loads of the people doing the natural sciences degree will do a module in philosophy or a module in social sciences. These are undergraduates choosing this post-disciplinary way of thinking about things. Yeah. So I think there's some interesting stuff going on. There's a lot of interesting stuff. There is stuff. Some of it I don't know. I mean, there's some of it I think goes up dead ends. It picks up the idea of manifold from topology, right? You're better off reading Poincaré who actually wrote popular science books himself, which I always really like about the greatest mathematician of the 20th century, writing popular science books.
Yeah.
Shows he was somewhat unusual mathematician, I think.
Yeah.
Yeah. But he was a mining engineer by background. Yeah.
Yeah.
So, there's some of this which goes off in odd directions, but there's some interesting ideas. I pick up stuff, for example, from actor network theory,
Yes.
where I disagree with actor network theory's ontology.
Yeah.
But actually, the thing I use the example of my own family, a lot of whom are master mariners, but also a friend of mine, that complex, pilots deal with complex systems. John Warren, this friend of mine who worked as a teacher of English in Suez at one point and used to play tennis with pilots on the Suez Canal, says that if they were off work for 3 months, they had to relearn the canal. Because the canal is a complex system. Yeah, and it changes. Yeah. So, that's what I mean about being able to know things, but to realize that there's a dynamism which underpins those kinds of things.
Yeah.
So there's stuff like that going on. But the applied stuff I think is very interesting. And there are very interesting young people. Lasse Gerrits, who's now head of the Institute of Housing and Development Studies at Erasmus University. Yeah.
Yeah.
Doing a lot. There's a lot of interesting work coming out of people like that.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
And there's books being written. We have a series in Routledge series in complexity, and things are being written, right?
Yeah.
Brian Castellani's written a very interesting book, which is really Complexity Takes on Freud.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I think it's tricky. The one important thing that I should mention is the Gulbenkian report on the future of the social sciences. Open the Social Sciences, written in the middle 1990s, which actually had Prigogine as one of its members because they had the good idea of getting scientists and people from the humanities, and also people, and especially in the case of the humanities, people from out with Europe as well, to talk about. And there's this big emphasis on post-disciplinary stuff. Yeah. And how many, look, some of the people I'm working with in CCON, they're mathematicians and physicists by background. Yeah. But they're working in this post-disciplinary way of thinking.
Yeah. So the focus for the future is a systemic view, isn't it? It's post-disciplinary. Yeah,
that's right.
It's post-differentiating between theory and practice. It's using practice to inform ideas.
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, for God's sake, look at COVID, right?
Yes.
Yeah. This is what we've got, right? I used to teach a course on sociology or social science of health and medicine, and I had quite a lot of students from the science department from these combined honours degrees who used to come do that. And one of the things I used to say, because I used to use history books to do it, is we're going to have another epidemic. Yeah? It's as sure as eggs are eggs, right? And if we're lucky, it'll not be as bad as the Spanish flu.
Yeah.
And but what's interesting, and I keep saying, I used to shock students by saying this, both my parents had siblings who died of tuberculosis.
Yeah.
Right? Yeah. And if they had been students in the 1930s at Durham University, during the course of their year, a couple of their classmates would have died of TB as well. Yeah. So, it was just realizing that there's an intersection between the natural and the social world. And a lot of the work I deal with, I've examined a surprising number of ecology PhDs.
Yeah.
Okay. Is at that interface. And COVID just tells you it in spades. We have a curative healthcare system which didn't really know what to do with the pandemic infectious disease. In the early 20th century, we had fever hospitals. Right? Yeah.
And also, what's the biggest thing that's happened to the world economy? A pangolin. It's
well, a bat apparently. Apparently, it was a bat.
I think with the bat originally, but even so, it's for the economists to become much more. We used to.
But one of the things I've been saying is that COVID, if it hadn't been for the fact that curative healthcare is such an enormously important component of our systems, because we've all gone through the health divide. Pretty well every society in the world's gone through the health divide. In other words, we don't die of infectious disease in infancy or childhood or through adult life in the way that we used to, right? COVID wouldn't have happened. The Spanish flu, which was far worse so far, because God help us if we get a variant that's as bad as the Spanish flu, had far less economic impact. Yeah? Because governments were not required to stop people dying of infectious diseases.